Fire is elemental and primitive. The most miserable situation clears up when somebody gets the fire going. It should be lit, burn up and boil a kettle within 20 minutes.
Well, it's taken me a bit longer than 20 minutes, but I didn't write those words. They come from Food in England, published in 1954 by Dorothy Hartley. And I use this book the whole time in my work as a historian and a curator. It's just brilliant. It's packed full of the most extraordinary, intriguing, fascinating little things you didn't know about history. Food in England was the product of more than 30 years of research. Its 600 pages are fabulously well written. They describe how food and kitchen utensils and cooking techniques were central to the lives of every single person in Britain, rich and poor. And the book's also full of Dorothy's own lively illustrations. I've been a big fan of Dorothy Hartley's best-known book for a long time, but I have to admit I don't know much about the woman herself. In this programme, I'm hoping to find out who this elusive and eccentric author really was, and what she achieved in her life. To do this, I'm going to meet some of her many and fervent admirers.
Look at all the detail. It's just so remarkable.
Don't tell anybody this way. I forged his signature and posted it off.
Let's go! I'm going to recreate parts of the lost world she describes so well in Food in England. Oh, he's opened his little eyelid. I haven't finished. Come back. And I'm going to follow in her footsteps. From the Yorkshire Dales, all across the Midlands, to her final home on the borders of Wales. I can't promise you that I'm going to sleep in the hedgerows like she did, but I am determined to discover who she was, why she wrote this book, and to pinpoint just how big a contribution it makes to the history of what we eat. Food in England is a treasure trove. It's a reference book, but also a thoroughly good read. It ranges from Saxon cooking to the Industrial Revolution, with chapters on everything from seaweed to salt. But to me, it's not a conventional history book. It hasn't got proper references to source material or footnotes, and historians like me worry about things like that. Does this really matter, though, when the heat's on in the kitchen? I'd like to know what cooks think about Dorothy Hartley. To find out, I've come to ask the award-winning chef and food writer, Roly Lee. I'm interested in Food in England because of what it tells us about the history of food, but what interests you in it as a chef?
I love her concentration on what the food means, not in terms of mythology, but in its place in the culture. And when she talks about mutton, for example, she talks about half a dozen different types of mutton, when they're at their best, where they come from, what they feed on, what gives them a different flavour. And the cooking element is just how to exploit that.
What sort of impression has Dorothy Hartley made on you and your cooking?
I think she's reinforced really my ideas about food. You know, I bang on about seasonality and context. I want to eat asparagus in May, for example, not because that's the best asparagus, although it is, not just because it's English and not French, although it is. I want to eat it then because that's when it feels right as part of that rhythm. It's spring, it's a shoot. And it comes after the deprivations of Lent and everything else. It's that celebration. And if you have asparagus at Christmas, you've just lost that. And that's, you know, that's an integral part of her thinking, I think.
Roly is demonstrating that very principle. He's cooking two dishes that Dorothy reckons are perfect in spring: red mullet and roast duck with fresh peas. It's pretty hot.
It's quite warm.
What I like is, although this is a hugely high-tech thing, actually, Dorothy shows a picture of meat being
Absolutely.
roasted in exactly the same way, with a vertical wall of
This is what
of
roasting
flame.
means. When people put something in an oven, you know, it's a sort of baking with steam. This is proper old-fashioned roasting where it's only cooking in its own fat. You just get the flavour of the meat itself on an open fire.
The duck will take another hour, but the mullet's ready. Wrapped in paper with butter and seasoning and baked whole for just 30 minutes. Dead simple.
Do you want to give it a go?
Yes, please. Wow, that's really salty and anchovy-like. Ugh. That's not what I was expecting at all. That is super delish. And you did hardly anything to it at all.
I've done nothing.
It's a respectful way to treat a beautiful fish, you'd say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What would you say to Dorothy Hartley if she were to walk into the room now?
Have some of the mullet lass.
Very good.
Please consider this book as an old-fashioned kitchen. Not impressive, but a warm, friendly place where one can come in any time and have a chat with the cook.
This book is an amazing treasure trove of information, not only history, but tradition and anthropology and culture and society. And it's also a book about Dorothy herself. It's quite also biographical. Here is a picture of her own grandfather's egg cosy with its knitted pom-pom on top. She said it was just like a woolly nightcap.
The breakfast egg was a Victorian institution. Really nice, homely families kept their eggs coddled in hot water under a china hen. According to superstition, empty eggshells should always be broken up, lest witches make boats thereof.
The first chapter is her memory of all the different kitchens that she's used throughout her lifetime. The earliest of them are in Yorkshire. She was born in Skipton, so that's where I'm off to now. Skipton is a busy market town at the southern end of the Yorkshire Dales. The Hartley family were based just up the hill from here. But they didn't live in an ordinary house. This is the place where Dorothy was born. It's a pretty gloomy and austere-looking place for little girls to grow up. It was, and it is, the local boys' grammar school. Her father was the headmaster. He came here in 1876. And his third child, Dorothy, was born in 1893, probably in his own private rooms, part of the main school building. Today, some of the boys are going to have a go at recipes Dorothy would have eaten here at the school in the 1890s. And at lunchtime, the rest of the pupils are going to try what they've made. To be honest, I'm not sure how well it's going to go down. What are you going to be making?
We're making stargazy pie.
Now, what is that? People won't know what it is.
Well, it's basically herring pie, but you've got the herring head sticking out the sides.
The heads are sticking out. Do you think this is going to go down well in the canteen?
No.
Go! All these recipes come from food in England.
I think it'll taste better than it looks.
I think you're right. The desserts are oatmeal pudding, and that's semolina. That's mutton broth made with sheep's bones, a staple here in Dorothy's day. And this is the dough for Yorkshire tea cakes. And finally, stargazy pie. Why do you leave the heads on then?
Because if we cut them off and cook them, we'll lose all the oil.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what it's going to look like. While the students are cooking, I'm going to find out what late Victorian life was like at the school for Dorothy and her family. So this room that we're in, now it's the library, it used to be the big school, it's called, in 1896. What went on in here? Is it a big classroom?
Yes, it's really the main teaching room.
How many boys are we talking about here?
You're talking about 80 boys overall, of whom about 20, never more than 30 in this period would have been boarders.
So here is Dr. Hartley, the headmaster, Mrs. Hartley, the Hartley kids, and that's little Dorothy there. What sort of a man was he? He looks very respectable here in his mortarboard.
Yes, you have to remember that the headmaster of the grammar school had a real status. It was a minor squirearchy, and so there was that sort of distance and respect in a way.
I have to say Dorothy in all of these pictures looks a little bit grumpy.
Yes, yes.
Would you like to share your childhood home with 80 boys? I'm not sure
I
would.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
And Dorothy's mother, Mrs. Hartley, she was involved in the running of the school, wasn't she?
She was, I think, pretty well the sole runner of the school. There's nobody but a matron, which they can't always afford, plus a sort of a job man, you see.
So Mrs. Hartley, she's essentially the head of catering.
I think she's probably the only caterer, really, most of the time.
Oh, golly.
From the finances, I can't see how it could have been run in any other way without her doing almost all the work herself.
Producing food for 80 boys. And this made an impression on Dorothy. She remembers it. She describes the school kitchen here. She said it was masculine and enterprising. I guess they had to be pretty enterprising to feed all of those boys. She talks about homemade bread rising each week in a huge tub set before the fire, and piles of Yorkshire tea cakes came daily from the baker.
It was here that I first realised the specialities of England. Bilberries from the mountains in leaking purple crates. From the east coast came barrels of herrings. Oxfordshire sent crates of wonderful fruit. From the north came sacks of oatmeal.
Roll up, get some stargazy pie.
Fish heads, fish tails, herrings.
You're supposed to eat the actual head and the tail.
No, you're not, but let's give it extra flavour.
Okay, have a bit, please.
Which one would you like, sir?
I don't even like fish.
Get some stargazy pie.
Please.
Get it whilst it's warm.
Use it all, promise.
They'll eat anything you put out for them. They like to come to school and have a bacon sandwich, and then at break time they come out with big slices of pizza, and then they come and have big bowls of pasta and homemade cake, and then they go home and eat again.
Imagine Mrs. Hartley then, the headmaster's wife, catering for 80 growing boys. How did she do it?
Don't know. She must have worked from 5 in the morning till 10 at night.
Nice.
Yeah, it's nice. Normal food's nicer.
Normal food is nicer. Oh, okay. Verdict on the semolina? Good. The Hartleys ate pretty well at the school. Not so people in the poorer farming communities nearby. In Food in England, Dorothy writes of families in the Dales whose diet depended on what they could produce from the land around them.
If you came here 100 years ago, you would have seen a different sort of farming. It would have been more of a mixed farming. There would have been sheep, there would have been cattle, but there would have also been crops, particularly oats, and a variety of barley that does well at this altitude called big. You're about 800 feet above sea level here. Wheat is just not going to succeed. Most villages were surrounded with oat fields.
It's kind of got more boring in a way, hasn't it?
Well, had to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
Of course, we aren't any longer.
No.
And that's really what this sort of food was about, really.
Self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
Northern grit.
Survival.
Dorothy visited the Dales regularly as a child. Later, she described how oats were the basic ingredient of meals up here.
Oatcake and porridge were the two staples of this region, and every farmhouse, every village, every area developed their own ways of making various oatcakes. They often went by their Norse name. They were sometimes called havakak or havacake.
Does it not mean have a cake? Help yourself.
Now, the word hafa or hava is a Norse word meaning oats. So haversack is a bag for putting your oats in.
So it is.
I've already made some batter.
Batter. What's in the batter?
It's a mixture of very, very fine sifted oatmeal, milk, water, a little bit of salt, and some yeast.
Easy peasy then.
Yeah. If you bring the bowl over and get as close as you can without burning yourself, okay, I'm going to ladle that onto the girdle, like that, and then I get the scraper and I go like that with it. There you go. We'll just let that cook. This is really food that has absolutely vanished and disappeared. You dip it in your soup for your evening meal. You'd wrap up cheese in it. It's very nice. It's really, really good stuff. Well worth reviving, I think. Don't burn yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, just use your fingers. That's it. Perfect. Okay, shall I hang that up for you?
I can do it.
Brilliant.
What do you actually think of Dorothy Hartley? Where does she fit into the history of food for you?
Dorothy is part of a group of people who started to actively try to investigate disappearing customs. People like Cecil Sharp, who was collecting folk songs and folk dances in the early 20th century. There was also a contemporary of Dorothy Hartley called Florence White, who was a founding member of the English Folk Cookery Association. And I think all of them realised they were living at a time when rural customs were vanishing rapidly. And I think the whole point of their activities was to try and record these things before they entirely disappeared.
That's what's really valuable, her work as an oral historian.
Yeah, that's the richest part of the book, is where she actually talks to a ploughman or a shepherd. It's when you hear the voice of the lady who's describing how she scrapes the bristles off her pig after she's killed it with a candlestick, you know. It's that kind of thing that's so marvellous about it. That is the best bit of the book. Yes.
That's the world we have lost.
Yeah.
In old-fashioned country houses, no housemaid's box was complete without a couple of goose pinions. Those strong, firm plumes which were so excellent for dusting ledges. A stiff-trimmed goose pinion is also kept by the lady's maid for taking the dust from velvet.
Dorothy remembered the Yorkshire Dales from her very earliest childhood. But at the start of the 20th century, she and her family moved down to the warmer landscape of the Midlands. By 1904, Edward Hartley was losing his eyesight. He had to give up his job as headmaster of the boys' school in Skipton. Instead, he became a rector in Rempston in Nottinghamshire, quite a small parish, and the family moved south. They ended up living here, in this Elizabethan, rambling, impressive house. And this is only the back.
A lovely old house with every medieval inconvenience. The nearest shop was 5 miles away and we had no car. A butcher called once a week, a grocer once a fortnight.
Dorothy was 11 years old when her family arrived here, and now she had a room of her own at the top of the house.
It was a double turn of wooden stairs and a low door into a little room, and a second door up wooden steps to a further attic. The old thatch was rotting and full of birds' nests, and there, crouched and cold, I worked from dawn. I loved that room. It was my citadel against all the hard work of long days, and in it I wrote my first book and got my master's art degree.
So this is the very place that Dorothy would work, between dawn and the time she had to leave to go to art school. And she used to feed the starlings out of the window here. And we know that for a fact because many years later she wrote letters about it. Do you think she's being a bit melodramatic here when she talks about how the old thatch was rotting up there in the attic and it was
No, because it was very much like that when I bought it.
Oh, OK. It wasn't thatch, but...
Felicity Fletcher-Wilson bought the rectory in 1999. And during renovations, she discovered a secret stash of Dorothy's letters written to the previous owner. What's great about these letters is that they're very personal. They're her reminiscences about her life here.
Yeah, I think that's what's really nice about them, because you read in the book about the house and it doesn't actually mention the name or anything, but you can put the letters to the book and you come out with a completely different story and something that's very, very personal, actually.
I like the description of how she prepares her workroom. She scrubbed the oak beams in the wall with hot vinegar. It's not what you'd expect a teenager to be doing, is it? Scrubbing old beams with hot vinegar.
No, not at all.
Dorothy quickly became a professional artist, didn't she?
Well, I think at this time she was already doing artwork. I found some illustrations of Dorothy's in a book by Geoffrey Henslow. And there are some 90-odd illustrations in here, which goes to show what a busy girl she was.
They seem to just set up all the things that she's going to be interested in. There's a real attention to historical costume, and also there's a lot of landscapes and countryside.
There are countryside. These are just the things that captured her imagination.
Now, this letter's really interesting because it's about food. We've got a sort of edible history of Edwardian Rempston village here, haven't we? I really like the fact that in the cottages, she says people don't have scales and they can't write. So when she says how much of that, they say about as much as Jim could eat at a meal. That much. Yeah.
After the bleak north, everything in the Midlands seemed warm, rich and ripe. The mutton was fat, the cakes full of eggs, and in September we made wonderful wines and jams and rich preserves.
By comparison with life in Yorkshire, this village must have seemed like a living larder, really. There's just so much food here, and so much of it. Just behind there were the pigsties. That's where Dorothy's pigs lived, and they must have eaten these pears off this tree above me. Like sensible, thrifty country people, the Hartleys wasted nothing when their pig was killed, including his head.
Follow the cut already down the middle and split the head into two pieces.
I'm helping pig keeper Tom Beebe to make a kind of pâté called brawn in Dorothy's kitchen and using her own recipe.
That might be better.
Ooh!
Did you feel that against the bone?
I shouldn't have thought about cutting someone's leg off. I think you're going to have to give a demo.
Right, I'll give it a try. Going a little bit off course. But
Yeah, it's not going down the middle, is it?
no, it should be okay, though. It's all going to end up in the same place.
That's it. Yay! Well done. Look at that.
I think we've got...
Ooh, look at his teeth. Look at his brain.
This bowl here, we're going to put all the nasty bits in, like tongue, brain, eyeballs, things like that.
We've got to get the eye out next.
The best way to do that is if you feel around, you can sort of feel an eye cavity around the bone, like there. And the best
he's opened his little eyelid.
Put the knife in and follow the bone all the way around and try and cut underneath the eyeball, so you take everything, the eyelid and everything out from underneath.
Oh my goodness, that is so frightening and horrible.
There we are, very good.
Oh, this is a curious mixture of disgusting and wonderful. This seems like a really horrible, alien, strange experience. But I suppose that as modern people, we're the odd ones out, really. We're the ones who aren't familiar. Ooh, there's his eye with this. But for centuries, people would have just been used to doing this every autumn.
Oh, they would have been, yeah. I think we've become quite detached in recent years from how our food is prepared, made, and actually where it comes from.
Killing the pig in the autumn, everybody did it.
Yes, a pig in a day, everyone would club together and they'd have a pig processed in a day. They do all the brawn, they do all the butchery, make sausages, cure bacon. Everyone would club together and get it done really quite quickly.
So we boiled it for a couple of hours and then we let it cool down. And now we're picking off all the meaty bits. I am a natural scavenger. There's something brilliant about finding something that others have overlooked.
Yeah.
And then we're going to pour in that leftover stock, and then as it cools, it will form a solid jelly. And we'll be able to make it into slices.
Yes.
Then eat it with mustard. Very important. Must be with mustard. That's what Dorothy says. So I'm pouring in the stock. How long do we have to leave it?
I'd want to leave it in a cool place overnight for it to set firmly, and then it'd be something nice to have for lunch tomorrow.
It has set into a proper glistening jelly, hasn't it?
It has, yes. For you?
Now, I'm really torn. I'm actually quite hungry. It smells nice. That's all good.
It appears.
But what's flashing into my mind is cutting out the pig's eye with the knife.
Really?
Yeah.
I think the best thing to do is give it a try and see what it ends up like. That's not bad. The mustard certainly helped. I quite like that.
I've overdone the English mustard. You're wolfing it down here.
That's quite nice. I'm quite enjoying it.
I'm sorry, I don't like it.
That's all right.
I'm sorry to say, I think it's really disgusting. I've done my best to try and like it. Why doesn't anybody eat brawn these days?
There are reasons. It tastes awful.
Dorothy left the rectory in the early 1920s and moved to London. The capital gave her room to develop her talents as an artist and writer. She gave art lessons at Regent Street Polytechnic, but spent her spare time in the British Museum. She was exploring the whole world of medieval England. I've come to meet the food writer and journalist Adrian Bailey, who met Dorothy in the late 1960s. I'm hoping he can shed some light on her fascination with medieval history.
Dorothy's father was a Chaucerian, and that was very likely where Dorothy's interest in the medieval world and the 14th century came from.
What was she really like?
She was very hospitable, quite funny, very elegant, in fact. She used to write to me and she would sign it, "Yours truly, D. Hartley, Miss," in brackets, just to establish the fact that here was a spinster you don't mess around with. She was extraordinary.
But some of these papers are old love letters. They contain clues about one quite serious relationship with a man called Mickey. He, though, was a heavy-drinking, elusive loner who worked as a ranger in Africa. Marriage was never on the cards and he died young. He says, "I will never settle now, and the next time I go home back to England I shall wander all over the British Isles with a toothbrush."
Yeah, which is what she would do.
Which is what she would do, so they're two of a type, really.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I think that deep down in her heart she didn't really want to be married. She didn't have time for a domestic life. She fought off proposals. There was one, Mr. Barham. He proposed to her by letter, and she replied with a long discourse on Viking burial customs and said, "That'll see him off."
She put him off with the Viking burial customs. Yes. That's one way of doing it.
That was typical of her. I rang her one day and she picked up the phone and, without asking who it was, said, "Can't talk to you now, I'm in the 14th century," and put the phone down. Could have been anybody. But that was her. She was like that. Somebody that had a great love for what she did, and she wanted to convey that to her readers, and greatly succeeded, because here we have food in England.
What's your opinion of the importance of this book?
It is the product of a lifetime's experience. It is a history book, it isn't a cookery book, and she goes back in history to the Victorian period and then back through to the ending up at in the Tudor world, which she loved.
Dorothy's engagement with history bore fruit in 1925 when she published her first book, Life and Work of the Peoples of England. While researching it, she came across a writer who was to have a profound influence on her life. A Tudor farmer and poet called Thomas Tusser. Thomas Tusser keeps cropping up in food in England. Dorothy was clearly very interested in him. He spent his life in 16th century Suffolk and she tracked him down there. This photo shows her standing up to her ankles in a bog, and it says on the back, "Me on Tusser's Marsh." Well, I think I need to visit Tusser's Marsh and Tusser's landscape to see what they might tell us about Dorothy herself. This is the spot, in what's known today as Constable Country, where Thomas Tusser's house once stood. He was born in Rivenhall in Essex in about 1524. 100 Good Points of Husbandry is his rhyming book about agriculture.
To take thy calling thankfully, and shun the path to beggary, to grudge in youth no drudgery, to come by knowledge perfectly, to follow profit earnestly, but meddle not with pilfery, to get by honest practisy, and keep thy getting covertly. These be the steps unfeigningly to climb to thrift by husbandry. Whoa, hop. Good lads. Right.
Tusser was one of the first writers to record the experience of ordinary tenant farmers.
You're going to go each side of the sticks?
Yeah, they should straddle like. Get up the steps.
A Suffolk farmer called Roger Clark works land very near to Tusser's farm and does it in a way that Tusser would have recognised 5 centuries ago. Tell me a bit about Suffolk punchers then, these enormous horses. Are they specially for ploughing?
Yeah, because if you look at the legs and you compare them with the Shire horse, which has a mass of feather, you'll see how clean they've kept, and that's why we call them clean-legged.
So the Shires get all muddy when they're going up and down, and that's no good?
The Suffolk horse was bred as the perfect agricultural horse.
He is a human tractor, not
Yeah.
a human tractor.
Yeah,
an
he's
equine
tractor. Absolutely, yeah. They have the oldest recorded pedigree, bar the thoroughbred.
Going back to
1750.
Wow.
I've always tried to keep Suffolk horses because they are an endangered species. In fact, there's more giant pandas about than there are Suffolk horses.
Really?
Yeah. But not only, I think it's important to maintain the horse as a breed, but to maintain the skills that went with it.
I can see that this is an
important.
art.
Yes, yeah, and it would be tragic if all these things, like ploughing, like harness making, and all things like that, were finished.
Thomas Tusser was ploughing with oxen. How do you think that would have worked?
Well, as I can see it, you had the oxen, but you also had a boy with you with a sharp stick to poke them along.
Poke them along.
With these, you don't need that. Tusser tells us, look well to thy horses in the stable thou must, let not your hay be foisty, or your chaff full of dust, nor stone in their provender, or feathers or clots, nor feed with green peas and for the breeding of bots.
So, don't let the hay be foisty.
Which was mouldy.
He doesn't eat foisty
No,
hay, obviously.
doesn't.
No stones in the food.
No,
and the horses,
no dust.
No dust?
No.
What are bots?
Bots is the larva of a gadfly.
Ah.
And they attach themselves to the stomach and then they come out through the skin. I mean, today we worm horses in November because that get rid of the bot larvae.
Now, I'm worried about Jester getting cold.
That's it.
Do we need
have
to
another
warm
round
up,
off?
do a bit more?
Yeah, well
right,
done.
Okay. Having visited Thomas Tusser's home and learnt a bit more about him, I can see why Dorothy was so attracted to him. He was like the Tudor version of her. In 1931, Dorothy published her edition of Thomas Tusser's poem. It's called Thomas Tusser and His Farming in East Anglia. Both of them were interested in crops and the land and seasons and how things were done, and both of them had the ability to express it in really simple language. Dorothy clearly shared Tusser's interest in everyday things, and she did probe really deeply into his life and work. I'm beginning to realise her research into Tusser's world shows that despite my earlier misgivings, she really was becoming a serious historian. In the 1930s, she travelled the country, documenting and illustrating rural ways of life in free books and a regular column for the Daily Sketch newspaper. I've come to visit someone who's spent many years researching this period of Dorothy's life. The potter and artist Mary Wandrush. And she's making me lunch.
We're not cooking it because it's already been smoked, and that is, in a sense, cooking it.
How do I get it out, like this?
No, you don't.
No, there's a trick.
The trick is this.
Oh, look at that. It lifts up.
Mary's warmed up some Arbroath smokies, smoked haddock from northeast Scotland, which Dorothy describes in one of her Daily Sketch articles.
So there's our lovely smoky, and I'll tell you what it's supposed to be like. It's supposed to be a gold-bronzed fish, smoke-dried, redolent with the savour of the peat.
And mind the bones.
Mind the bones.
That's really good. You certainly need the butter with it.
Most delicious.
What do you think?
Very nice. It's delicious, but I don't think we should be eating it in your lovely warm kitchen. We should be in a smoke-filled cottage in the middle of a peat bog in Scotland.
I can see you're a romantic, Lucy. Yes.
Because you're an artist, what do you see in her as a fellow artist?
Well, really, I see her more as an illustrator than as an artist. And her drawings are so wonderfully accurate. So what really fascinates me is the way she makes it absolutely clear what everyone or everything is doing, how it's made, the detail. And despite from being so accurate, they're not boring at all. They're all lively. Her observation is acute. Look at all the detail, the tool you're using and the plaiting, and it's just so remarkable.
What do you think is the most important thing of all about Dorothy Hartley?
Well, it's the breadth of her interests. She was really a very adventurous woman and very hard-working. And one of my theories is this was because she wasn't married, didn't have children, or some fractious husband, and that whole focus went on whatever she was researching at the time.
By the time coal cooking came into fairly general usage, the fireplace had moved from the middle of the room to the side wall. Chimneys had been built climbing up the older houses like hollow caterpillars clinging to a leaf.
Tell me a bit about your amazing cottage. How long have you been living here?
Well, I bought the house in 1955. My husband, I was going to say buggered off. You can't say bugger, I believe. Never.
I think you can.
Off.
I think if you want to.
Yes. And so I was left with 2 children. My 3rd child was born here. But I'd never lived in the country, so I had to learn about how to do it. And it was reading Hartley that I began to get some idea about cooking on the fire and so on.
So the chapter in here about fuels and fireplaces, for you that was like an instruction manual to your cottage?
Absolutely, it really was, yes. I was fascinated to see all her wonderful illustrations of the different ways of cooking on the fire.
Dorothy devoted no less than 30 pages to fuels and fireplaces in Food in England. She researched the book as she roamed the countryside, sometimes by car, sometimes by bike. Sleeping rough under the stars, she relished the hardships.
I was freezing on the Pilgrim's Way. My fingers were claw-curled with cold inside my gauntlets. Almost I could hear the ghosts of Chaucer's riders, their horse bells tinkling down the path like melting ice.
Throughout her travels, Dorothy made connections between the past and the present. When she saw canal workers, or bargees, cooking a one-pot meal on their barges, she recognised how closely it was related to the medieval cauldron. And sure enough, there it is in the chapter on fuels and fireplaces. The food writer Rose Prince is going to cook the bargeman's dinner just as Dorothy described. It's ancient, this dish is.
I love the cross-section in her drawing where you see all of the vegetables with the meat on top all layered up, and look above and you see the cauldron and there's pieces of meat and fat wrapped in cloth. So much of what she saw had to be taken from history books. This was the real thing.
Right, turnips first?
Turnips at the base for sweetness, fresh belly of pork, a little bit of smoked salt pork to add flavour. On top of that, carrots and parsnips. Now, she says water. Just gain a little bit of extra flavour if you have some nice gelatinous broth like this. On top of that, a huff paste, which was a suet crust, essentially. Acts as an insulating layer. On top of that, some sliced potatoes, more huff paste.
OK.
On top of that, some apples. If you're going to have a pudding.
Yeah.
That will fuel the bargee.
It's such a simple but powerful idea, isn't it?
Once you've made that preparation, it cooks itself.
Great.
Oh!
Into the water, do you think?
There we go.
The brilliant idea here is that the one pot will cook the main meal and the pudding and anything else you want slowly in the boiling water. It'll be ready to eat after about 2 hours, or you can just leave it to bubble away all day until the boatsman, like Tim here, gets hungry. Oh, they're cooked. It's worked. That is true cooked food.
And look at the pastry's cooked.
Oh, it looks cooked. It looks like a suet pudding.
Uh-huh, yeah.
The apples have kept their shape nicely,
Apple sass.
Needs a bit of custard on there, I think.
There it is. Bit of turnip. Now then.
Great.
Thank you very much. Smashing.
You got us a fork there?
We do.
That warms the cockles of the heart, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's great. Just the sort of thing you need at the end of a day.
What are your final thoughts then on Dorothy, Rose? What does she mean to you?
I think she's the most interesting writer to have covered British food for a simple point that she is the person who found out what everyone is eating. So often we know what kings ate.
Yeah.
And we know what ladies in Tudor households prepared for their, their big kitchens, but we don't know what people ate. And through her very forensic investigation into all the equipment and the animal breeds and the landscape, she found out.
Yeah.
And that marks her out above everyone else.
I agree with Rose. It's Dorothy's interest in ordinary people that's really extraordinary. And I'm beginning to appreciate that she was a chronicler of her own times. Food in England isn't just a history book. It also paints a picture of the England she crisscrossed between the wars. In her newspaper articles and photographs, her fascination with the way people lived and worked on the land is plain to see. She devotes no less than 29 pages of Food in England to the very mundane subject of sheep.
An old shepherd and myself spent one summer mapping the moorland. It was a curious piece of work and very enlightening as to the mentality of mutton.
Dorothy writes really romantically and evocatively about farming life, but she also includes lots of utilitarian information too, like absolutely everything you can do with absolutely every single part of a cow or a sheep. She brings to life the annual spectacle of the sheep shearing. This is Manor Farm, a hill farm right up above Wharfdale, and it's a good day to be here because it's shearing day. Chris Akerig's family came here as tenant farmers in the Yorkshire Dales just after the Second World War. These days, Chris runs the business with his 3 sons. My turn now. First, we're just going to practice cuddling a sheep.
Just grip it well. That's it.
I've got them.
That's
Got
it.
them.
Next.
I love sheep. I love you.
No, don't pull the wall. You always pull the thing back. That's right.
I'm so worried about hurting
No,
them.
you're not hurting there. That's it. Right, put that down.
Here we go. You're done. You're done. Oh,
No,
dear.
That'll drop off.
That's not brilliant, is it?
But it's not too bad,
I haven't finished. Come back.
We don't need a dog, we have Lucy. It's pretty good.
Oh, it's dreadful compared with the others.
Distinctive anyway, isn't it?
Yeah. So what was it like in Dorothy Hartley's childhood then, in the sort of late Victorian times? What was the sheep shearing like?
Well, traditionally people would help each other do it. And of course it was much quieter. I remember an old chap telling me once that he was the very first one to take a machine round to one of these parties, right, where they all, you'd perhaps invite, you do it with your neighbours and perhaps invite some other people to come and they all have a clipping session, you see, and he went with his machine. But of course it meant that the others couldn't hear each other talking, so they never asked him again.
That's modernity for you, isn't it?
Exactly.
Farming in the Dales has changed beyond all recognition since Dorothy Hartley's day. Over the years, Chris has had to take on more and more land to make a decent living. He now farms around 2,000 acres.
It's not just us that's done this, you know, lots of farms in the Dale have all expanded and taken over another farm, and it's a shame because it's depopulated the Dale.
Yeah.
You know, on the social side especially.
There aren't as many jobs though, are there, for human beings?
I mean, my grandfather milked 10 cows, kept poultry, a few turkeys at Christmas, 20 pigs and a few sheep, and employed a man and a boy and made a good living.
Yeah.
But I mean that would be a sort of part-time job today.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the difference. You just need so much to make a living nowadays.
At sheep shearings, baskets of beef sandwiches were carried around, each with a mustard pot tied to the handle. No one eats mutton at a sheep shearing.
Right, I'm having mustard.
I'm going to have onions, I think.
Go on then.
Do you, Emily? any excuse to eat beef. It's pretty good.
Dorothy's writing is so compelling, partly because she's capturing a world just on the cusp of destruction. She described the lifestyle of Chris Akrig's grandfather and others like him, even as it began to fall apart, with mass production and mechanisation. 2 generations and a world war later, it was a way of life that would be lost forever.
Bracken used to be cut for bedding for farm animals, for covering in root crops, and for weaving into shelters and hurdles. Quantities were used by the slate and heavy earthenware industries to pack their ware for road transport. Now it is not cut, and has become a desperate weed instead of a useful growth.
Most of the research for food in England was done during her wandering years. But after 1945, Dorothy settled down here, in North Wales, and this is where my journey ends. She lived in the village of Ron, in a house she'd inherited from her mother, overlooking the Llangollen Canal. It was here that 30 years of painstaking observation came together in her magnum opus, the book that's her greatest achievement. Food in England was published in 1954. Reviewers loved it. Harold Nicholson, writing in the Times, said, "Miss Dorothy Hartley's Food in England will become a classic." He was right. Food in England has never been out of print. By the time it was published, she was well into her 60s. I've come to her house to meet 4 people who remember Dorothy from these last years of her life, including Malcolm Wiles, whose father, Teddy, helped her to move in.
Wiles she used to call my dad, didn't she? I want you to go to so-and-so. You know, not can you, I want you to go.
Malcolm's wife, Rosemary, still has the letter that Dorothy sent with instructions about moving.
I don't know what that is.
This was just like Dorothy. Instead of listing her furniture, she draws it.
First of all, in her mind, was her work desk. This was where her writing was done, and she had put that first.
This is the most important item of all of her possessions.
Yes.
The desk where she does the writing.
Yes, that's right. And herself last.
Yep.
The cat.
Sewing machine, cycle, cat, there he is.
Yes, Mark.
Mark the cat. And here's Dorothy herself.
Yeah.
She's carrying a packet of sandwiches, a trifle cutter, and it also says that she's carrying a small garden spade.
Yes.
Would you describe her as easy to get to know?
Well, I found her easy to get to know. She didn't phone, she arrived by the door, didn't she? The Welsh are, well, come day, go day, that's the slang word, isn't it? You know, anything'll do, tomorrow'll do, there's no rush, but that wasn't Miss Hartley, it's now, isn't it? That was Miss Hartley, now.
Was she generous?
Well, money-wise, no, because she hadn't got any. But as I say, she'd do anything for you.
Yeah.
She'd never see anybody in trouble, would she, Val?
No.
Never see anybody in trouble. And she didn't want the world to know that she'd done this, that or the other for him.
She asked me to type a letter for her on
an
old machine, a rickety old machine, and she dictated it to me, you see. Oh, she kept changing her mind. Oh, no, cross that out. So cross it out, X it out, no tip-X in those days. And ended up with a whole paragraph X'd out. I said, I'll type it nicely for you. No, she signed it. Date about, just post it on your way home. So I'm afraid I stole a piece of paper from her study on the way home, and I typed it on my machine.
Oh, you typed it properly?
And don't tell anybody this, will you? I forged her signature and posted it off.
What's the most personal item of Dorothy's that you own?
I think probably the most interesting one that came out of all the boxes and files and papers was her handbag.
A handbag? Look at this, it's the handbag of Dorothy Hartley.
And it's more or less just as the contents were in there.
That seems to me exactly the sort of thing I would imagine her carrying, something big that you could knock people on the head with if you wanted to. Can I open it?
Please do, yeah.
That's such an intimate thing to do, to look into a lady's handbag.
Yeah.
It feels wrong to look into somebody's handbag.
Oh, she wouldn't mind.
I guess she'd have done the same thing, wouldn't she? Yeah. If she found our handbags lying around, she'd be right in there having a look.
Something handcrafted in there, she would.
Now, here we've got a little knife. Little horn pen knife. Oh, look, this is so characteristic. It's her ticket to the reading room of the British Museum. Yes. Miss D. Hartley, not transferable. That's just the sort of thing I would have hoped to find. Oh, and we've got another one. The Departments of Manuscripts at the British Library. Here's something else incredibly characteristic. She's carrying around an atlas. It's an atlas of the British Isles, so she always knows where she is and where she's going next.
Yeah.
That really is the woman in a bag, isn't it? All of those things together there.
I'll tell you now, Lucy, I walked in here today and it affected me. I've not been in here since the day of the funeral. And when I come through that door...
And she's not here?
There was a lump in my throat. We weren't close nor anything like that, no more than doing things for her. But I still felt, you know, as they say what it was, there was a lump in my throat.
Having followed Dorothy's journey to its very end, I'm surprised and impressed to find a respectable schoolmaster's daughter following such an unconventional course through life. I've come to realise she's more than a great writer. I think she's an admirable human being. Dorothy died in 1985, and it was Malcolm who brought her body up from the house here to the churchyard. I was really moved by how much Malcolm and her other friends still seem to miss Dorothy. They regret the fact that she didn't leave any children, but instead she did leave us this amazing book. And as I followed her up and down the country, from Yorkshire to Leicestershire to Suffolk to Wales, I've really come to appreciate just how magnificently eccentric she really was. She devoted her whole life to this mad quest to capture a lost world. And thank goodness she did. The world needs these crazy, passionate people like Dorothy. There's just one more piece to put into the picture. A home movie showing Dorothy doing what she loved to do, working in the garden and digging up potatoes for dinner.
If everything I possess vanished suddenly, I'd be sorry. But I value things unpossessed. The wind and trees and sky and kind thoughts much more. What a poetic old party, eh?
And our food, glorious food season continues as Clarissa Dixon Wright tucks into 3 square meals in a brand new series, getting to grips with the full English in Breakfast, tomorrow at 9. Next, though, we have it cold, toasted, wrapped around meat and covered in fat. Time shift charts our loaf affair with bread.
Thank you for watching The Amazing TV. Don't forget to subscribe.
The element is just how to exploit that.
What sort of impression has Dorothy Hartley made on you and your cooking?
I think she's reinforced really my ideas about food. You know, I bang on about seasonality and context. I want to eat asparagus in May, for example, not because that's the best asparagus, although it is, not just because it's English and not French, although it is. I want to eat it then because that's when it feels right as part of that rhythm. It's spring, it's a shoot, and it comes after the deprivations of Lent and everything else. It's that celebration. And if you have asparagus at Christmas, you've just lost that. And that's, you know, that's an integral part of her thinking, I think.
Rowley is demonstrating that very principle. He's cooking 2 dishes that Dorothy reckons are perfect in spring: red mullet and roast duck with fresh peas.
Oh, it's pretty hot.
It's quite warm.
What I like is, although this is a hugely high-tech thing, actually, Dorothy shows a picture of meat being
Absolutely.
roasted in exactly the same way, with a vertical wall of
This is what
of
roasting
flame.
means. When people put something in an oven, you know, it's a sort of baking with steam. This is proper old-fashioned roasting, where it's only cooking in its own fat. You just get the flavour of the meat itself on an open fire.
The duck will take another hour, but the mullet's ready. Wrapped in paper with butter and seasoning and baked whole for just 30 minutes. Dead simple.
Do you want to give it a go?
Yes, please. Wow, that's really salty and anchovy-like. Ugh. That's not what I was expecting at all. That is...
Fire is elemental and primitive. The most miserable situation clears up when somebody gets the fire going. It should be lit, burn up and boil a kettle within 20 minutes.
Well, it's taken me a bit longer than 20 minutes, but I didn't write those words. They come from Food in England, published in 1954 by Dorothy Hartley. And I use this book the whole time in my work as a historian and a curator. It's just brilliant. It's packed full of the most extraordinary, intriguing, fascinating little things you didn't know about history. Food in England was the product of more than 30 years of research. Its 600 pages are fabulously well written. They describe how food and kitchen utensils and cooking techniques were central to the lives of every single person in Britain, rich and poor. And the book's also full of Dorothy's own lively illustrations. I've been a big fan of Dorothy Hartley's best-known book for a long time, but I have to admit I don't know much about the woman herself. In this programme, I'm hoping to find out who this elusive and eccentric author really was, and what she achieved in her life. To do this, I'm going to meet some of her many and fervent admirers.
Look at all the detail. It's just so remarkable.
Don't tell anybody this, will you? I forged her signature and posted it off.
Let's go!
I'm going to recreate parts of the lost world she describes so well in Food in England.
Oh, he's opened his little eyelid. I haven't finished. Come back.
And I'm going to follow in her footsteps, from the Yorkshire Dales, all across the Midlands, to her final home on the borders of Wales. I can't promise you that I'm going to sleep in the hedgerows like she did, but I am determined to discover who she was, why she wrote this book, and to pinpoint just how big a contribution it makes to the history of what we eat. Food in England is a treasure trove. It's a reference book, but also a thoroughly good read. It ranges from Saxon cooking to the Industrial Revolution, with chapters on everything from seaweed to salt. But to me, it's not a conventional history book. It hasn't got proper references to source material or footnotes, and historians like me worry about things like that. Does this really matter, though, when the heat's on in the kitchen? I'd like to know what cooks think about Dorothy Hartley. To find out, I've come to ask the award-winning chef and food writer, Roly Lee. I'm interested in food in England because of what it tells us about the history of food. But what interests you in it as a chef?
I love her concentration on what the food means, not in terms of mythology, but in its place in the culture. And when she talks about mutton, for example, she talks about half a dozen different types of mutton, when they're at their best, where they come from, what they feed on, what gives them a different flavour. And the cooking...
Super delish. And you did hardly anything to it at all?
I've done nothing.
It's a respectful way to treat a beautiful fish, you'd say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What would you say to Dorothy Hartley if she were to walk into the room now?
Have some of the mullet lass.
Very good.
Please consider this book as an old-fashioned kitchen. Not impressive, but a warm, friendly place where one can come in any time and have a chat with the cook.
This book is an amazing treasure trove of information, not only history, but tradition and anthropology and culture and society. And it's also a book about Dorothy herself. It's quite autobiographical. Here is a picture of her own grandfather's egg cosy with its knitted pom-pom on top. She said it was just like a woolly nightcap.
The breakfast egg was a Victorian institution. Really nice, homely families kept their eggs coddled in hot water under a china hen. According to superstition, empty eggshells should always be broken up, lest witches make boats thereof.
The first chapter is her memory of all the different kitchens that she's used throughout her lifetime. The earliest of them are in Yorkshire. She was born in Skipton, so that's where I'm off to now. Skipton is a busy market town at the southern end of the Yorkshire Dales. The Hartley family were based just up the hill from here. But they didn't live in an ordinary house. This is the place where Dorothy was born. It's a pretty gloomy and austere-looking place for little girls to grow up. It was, and it is, the local boys' grammar school. Her father was the headmaster. He came here in 1876. And his third child, Dorothy, was born in 1893, probably in his own private rooms, part of the main school building. Today, some of the boys are going to have a go at recipes Dorothy would have eaten here at the school in the 1890s. And at lunchtime, the rest of the pupils are going to try what they've made. To be honest, I'm not sure how well it's going to go down. What are you going to be making?
We're making stargazy pie.
Now, what is that? People won't know what it is.
Well, it's basically herring pie, but you've got the herring heads sticking out the sides.
The heads are sticking out. Do you think this is going to go down well in the canteen?
No.
Go! All these recipes come from Food in England.
I think it'll taste better than it looks.
I think you're right. The desserts are oatmeal pudding, and that's semolina. That's mutton broth made with sheep's bones, a staple here in Dorothy's day. And this is the dough for Yorkshire tea cakes. And finally, stargazy pie. Why do you leave the heads on them?
Because if we cut them off and cook them, we'll lose all the oil.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what it's going to look like. While the students are cooking, I'm going to find out what late Victorian life was like at the school for Dorothy and her family. So this room that we're in, now it's the library.